Okay, so to begin with, this isn't my what if, it's actually a fanfic. The link will be in the description. I personally haven't read this, so I don't know what happens in the story, so I'll find out after the story is posted. Anyways, let's get started. Shota Aizawa sat behind the steering wheel of his car. His body was moving without much input from his mind at the moment. Sheer instinct and muscle memory allowed him to stop at every red light and turn whenever he was supposed to turn. He had driven this path hundreds of times in his life, possibly even thousands if he was being realistic. The Musutafu police headquarters should only be a 15-minute drive from the UA campus. That was during the most chaotic hours of midday traffic. This late at night should have only taken him 5 minutes at most to return to school. He knew this logically, but he couldn't help but feel like this particular drive was taking forever. He shot a sideways glance to his passenger, cringing to himself silently. His student hadn't moved a muscle since he had entered the car when they had left the police station. In his career as a professional hero, Shota had learned to listen to his instincts. A single second of hesitation was all it took to make the difference between life or death in a profession like his. But, unfortunately, he had seen too many lives lost and seen too many careers cut short because of a single second of hesitation. He swore he would never make that mistake. He's telling the truth. When the idea of a traitor in UA was first put forward, Aizawa didn't put much stock into it. It was just Mike being Mike, after all. But like a virus, he had let the idea affect his thinking, and soon he saw things that weren't there. Some things that couldn't have been there. He knew that now. These past few months, he had been forcing himself to chase phantoms that didn't exist, that couldn't have existed. Paranoia had turned his own instincts against him. "Hey, kid," Shota said awkwardly as his car slowed down to a red light. "You did good in there." The boy didn't answer. Shota half expected Midoriya to retreat back into the shell he wore on the first day of class. That same nervous ball of anxiety he remembered from back before the USJ. A person who felt the need to apologize for accidentally shutting a door too loudly. A person who tried his best to melt into the background and shun the attention his fellow students instantly craved for one reason or another. He expected Izuku to be a wreck. What he didn't expect was this. He was still and quiet, but he certainly wasn't relaxed. The boy's shoulders were too stiff, and his posture was too rigid. He certainly didn't look like someone relieved at being proven innocent of what he had been accused of. The usual excitement that radiated off of Izuku wasn't there either. Gone was the subtle twitch of his hands when he was nervous or bouncing his leg to defuse his excess energy. Whatever nerves Shota would have expected to see in a regular person, someone who had been thrust into a situation like this just wasn't there. The underground hero shuddered when he looked back at his student in the back seat of the car. Those were not the eyes he had grown accustomed to seeing when he saw his student. "Of course not, you idiot," Shota thought to himself as he turned his attention back to the road in front of him as he bit back a curse. "Midoriya," Shota said, his voice hoarse and strained. "If you want to talk about can you take me to my home instead of the dorms?" Izuku interrupted, his voice sounding more hollow than it did the last time he spoke during the interrogation. "I think it would be for the best." Shota froze, almost stopping the car in the middle of the street as his head recognized his student's words. He wanted to say something, anything, right now. Still, he found himself agreeing with the boy despite every instinct in his body screaming at him right now. Maybe a good night's sleep would do wonders for everyone involved with this mistake. It would certainly do Izuku some good if he was given space while everyone at UA came to terms with what had happened these past few weeks. Much work needed to be done to fix what needed to be fixed after all of this. They drove in silence the rest of the way. The sinking feeling in Shota's stomach was getting deeper with each passing moment, his mind twisting itself into a knot as he tried to find the right words. Finally, he pulled to the apartment complex the boy shared with his mother. He paused as his car pulled to a stop, but before he could say anything, the sound of his car door slamming shut shook him out of his thoughts. "Izuku." Whatever the underground hero was going to say was cut off as his student exited the vehicle. Then, without saying a word, Izuku walked away into the darkness of the night, not even bothering to look back as he did. The former number 1 hero and symbol of peace, All Might, now just Toshinori Yagi, placed his drink down on the bar countertop. The former number 1 hero was alone in the hotel bar, the dinner rush long since over by the time the latest teaching workshop had let out from the main conference room. He leaned forward onto the barstool, simply enjoying the silence of the late-night crowd. Today had been one long day of speech after speech, seminar after seminar, and an almost endless line of teaching workshops. He never thought he could feel so tired and run down after hearing other people speak, but here he was. He fingered the glass of sparkling lemon water with a sigh. This was the closest thing to an alcoholic drink he could stomach these days, and he desperately wanted an ice-cold beer after the day he had. Nevertheless, he was glad he had decided to take Nedzu up on his offer to join this teaching seminar. God knew he needed it. Despite initially taking a position at UA to search for a successor, he had taken a liking to it quite well. It was just a shame he wasn't particularly good at it. He remembered reading that those who held natural talent in a particular field relied more on instincts and intuition, far more so than any skills learned through training or study. Which meant they had trouble teaching their skills to a new generation. Toshinori had been lucky. After fumbling a bit, he took to one for all like a duck to water. The quirk felt like an extension of himself, and his ability to manipulate it was intuitive, even initially. His mentor had barely needed to give him instruction on how to use it before he got the hang of it. He only required minor adjustments for how he used it, which had been outstanding for him when he was a student. Now, decades later, he had nothing to fall back on to use for when he became a teacher himself. He was ashamed to say that this mentally had done nothing more than weigh his students down. It was why he had thrown himself into learning everything he could learn about teaching now that he was officially retired. He had all the time in the world now to be the best teacher he could be for his kids. But while he knew taking a few days away from UA would be a good thing, in the long run, he couldn't get over the feeling in his gut that he had made a colossal mistake in coming here. I don't know, everyone just feels off. He remembered young Midoriya's words, the memory making Toshinori's hair stand up on his neck as he did so. The past few weeks, his apprentice had felt off about his classmates. They had been seemingly acting distant towards him these past few months, but those actions had apparently gotten worse as time went on. It had been years since Toshi was a teenager himself, decades even. However, he still remembered the minefield of teenaged emotions. At first, he assumed that it was just Izuku being Izuku, seeing problems he could work to fix that didn't actually exist. But then he noticed the little things. Izuku would be the last one picked when class assignments needed to be completed in groups. However, most of the time, he wasn't picked at all. Which meant Izuku was signaled out for one-on-one work with one of the teachers, being kept isolated from the rest of the class. In addition, Izuku had taken the habit of having his lunch period alone in the library, usually under the watchful eyes of at least one staff member, instead of the cafeteria, with his friends. Toshi also could have sworn he had seen his student training alone when he knew for a fact that the rest of Class 1A had taken a day trip to an amusement park. Had Izuku ignored his friends to focus on his training? He thought it was possible, but it didn't seem like something the green-haired teen would willingly do. Come to think of it, Toshinori couldn't even remember the last time he had seen Izuku with young Yurika or young Tinya. The three of them were attached to the hip not too long ago. Was this just typical teenage angst? Or was something more serious going on? Yagi was shaken from his musings by the vibration of his phone. He smiled at the name, but the same sinking feeling returned. Why was young Midoriya calling him this late? Hello, my boy, All Might said, his excited voice masking his concerns. What can I do for you? The heavy pause on the other side of the line made Toshinori's heart drop. All Might, something happened. What do you mean? Ida Tinya said. His voice was a low whisper as he stared at the form of his homeroom teacher. Izuku was not the traitor. The eraser hero said, his tone of voice its usual baritone but holding a slight tremor. A tremor the one a class wasn't used to hearing out of their teacher. We were wrong. The sound of glass shattering against the kitchen's tile floor broke through the deafening silence of the Class 1A dorm room. But US said. Jiro said as she took a step forward, ignoring the shattered glass of the bottle that Zero had dropped in disbelief. You said Izuku. He was innocent. What do you mean he's innocent? Denki said, the beginning of tears appearing in the corners of his eyes as he took a step forward only to be stopped by the invisible hand of Toru. You showed us the proof, didn't you? Denki choked back a sob as he saw his teacher stare at him. The stoic look on his face made Denki feel the need to throw up as he thought about what he and the others had put their friend through. A look of sickening realization Shoten noticed mirrored on all 19 faces of his students. That's fucking bullshit. Katsuki Bakugo shouted, making a beeline towards his teacher. You said you were certain. You said there was no doubt in your mind. And I was wrong, Shota said, his tone even despite the hurricane of emotions raging inside his head. You don't get to be wrong about this. It was surprisingly Momo who spoke up, her own face a mask of horror and shock as she was forced to process what she had done these past few weeks. What all of his students had done these past few weeks. Kota sat silently on the couch, his head in his hands as he silently wept. Sato and Shoji hadn't moved since Shota had spoken, both of their huge forms frozen to the floor as they numbly stared at their teacher. You're sure about this, right? Ida said quietly, his voice hollow and broken as he looked towards his teacher with pleading eyes. He looked as if he was begging to be told he hadn't thrown away his friendship for nothing. Detective Tsukachi's quirk is categorized as a lie detector, Shota said, his voice driving a spike into the heart of 19 teenagers as he spoke. It has a 100% success rate. The reaction was instantaneous. He had learned quickly on his first day as Class 1 a homeroom teacher that his students, for better or for worse, were a highly passionate bunch. Whether it be Bakugo's ego and pride, to Aoyama's eccentricities, all the way to Kirishima's boisterous declarations of manliness. His class was a powder keg that wasn't afraid to show emotion whenever the moment called for them. He just never thought he would see them all like this at once. Kirishima was shaking in his seat on the couch. The telltale beginnings of an anxiety attack beginning to show on his features. Mina had started crying, her usual pink features turning puffy and red as she looked at him like he was a monster. Ida had collapsed onto the couch. His knees and legs looked lifeless as his eyes stared emotionless and numb at his teacher. Oh shit, oh shit, oh shit, Mineta repeated to himself, muttering as he used the wall to steady himself. I told you. Okako said as she turned to look at her classmates, her face radiating anger and resentment for all to see. I told every single one of you. The brown-haired girl couldn't finish her words as she balled her hands into fists, her face a twisted mask of anger and horror fighting for dominance. She gagged for air as the tears rushed down her face, no sound leaving her mouth as her body collapsed onto the ground as Tsu and Momo held her tightly in their embrace. Cut the crap, round face. Katsuki shouted as he got into the gravity user's personal space. You abandoned him just like the rest of us, so get off your fucking high horse. Don't talk to her like that. Tsu said as the brunette cried into her shoulder. Can't you see how upset she is? You were the one who spread the rumors about him getting his quirk from All for One. Momo shouted back as she shoved Katsuki away from Okako. Shota was afraid his resident explosion user would have died before hitting the ground if looks could kill. You've been saying terrible things about him since the first day of class. Don't you put your hands on me, you stupid. Enough. Eraserhead spoke, the authority of his position enough to stun his students out of their stupor as he stepped closer to them. None of this is helpful. Stop putting the blame of this on one another. His students were silent as they all stared at him, a torrent of emotion covering each of their faces. It's my fault, Shota said, his voice breaking slightly at the admission before he regained his composure. You were all following the instructions given to you by the staff. So none of you should be at one another's throats, is that clear? He could feel their eyes upon him, and for a moment, the only sounds audible in the room were the sounds of Okako crying into Tsu's shoulder. What's gravity, hey Deku? What's gravity? I understand if you don't want to speak to me. I deserve it. I messed up, and I know what I did was terrible, but I want you to know that I am willing to do anything to fix my mistakes. Please just call me. What's gravity? I want to hear your voice. Message cannot be sent. The stillness that filled the conference room was more oppressive than Aizawa imagined it would be. Every person in the room seemed to be expecting something to happen at that moment. Almost silently begging for someone to say something that would make the situation better and soothe the dark thoughts that flooded their minds. He's not the traitor. Midnight said, her confident voice as soft as a whisper as she tested the words on her lips. Everyone had flinched at her question. The words feeling like a punch to their collective guts. That doesn't. She was still in denial of the revelation. Just like many others, she had adored Izuku. The 18-plus heroine had taken a shine to the green-haired student early in the year. Shota had seen her stay after class to give Izuku private lessons regarding his rather impressive-looking sketches. It was something he knew she viewed as one of the highlights of her day. But then she heard the possibility of him being the traitor. She regarded her student as nothing more than a threat, hardening her heart to the boy. She was a pro-hero before she was a teacher. And as a hero, she had a responsibility to protect citizens from villains. They all did. Izawa turned to look at Vlad, the large man still frozen in shock at the realization. The homeroom teacher of 1B had been rather adamant on his opinions of the possibility of a traitor and was not afraid to show it. Throw the boy to the authorities and be done with it. It was the casual distaste for the boy that had bled into the rest of Vlad's students and something the blood quirk user knew he had to rectify as soon as he could. What now? Present Mike said as he removed his glasses, showing his bloodshot eyes for the rest of the staff to see. What we can. Shota said as he took his seat. But, we have an uphill battle ahead of us. You got that right, Snipe said, readjusting his gas masks to wipe a tear out of his eyes. We royally screwed that little guy up. I screwed him up, Shota thought bitterly to himself as he scanned the group of heroes in front of him. The commission assured us that they had been looking into the allegations since the beginning of the year. Present Mike said as he looked towards his best friend, almost begging the underground hero to say anything that even remotely justified what they had done. Does this mean they were full of shit when they brought this to us? I've seen the evidence the commission brought forward, Shota said with a shake of his head. His childhood friend seemed to deflate with each word said. Whatever wasn't outright fabricated was made up on the spot. Those sons of bitches. Midnight said with disgust, whether because of her own actions or those of the commission Shota couldn't tell. They used us. Shota couldn't help but agree. It wasn't until the wheels of the interrogation had already been underway when doubt began to crawl in Shota's shed. Where others saw guilt, he only saw fear. Where others saw suspicious behavior, he saw someone trying to make sense of his life crumbling apart. Maybe if he hadn't taken his suspicions to the commission, all of this could have been avoided. If he had trusted his student. Izuku is a mature young man, Ectoplasm said, his hands clasped in front of his face as he leaned forward. A little emotional at times, sure, but he's smart enough and mature enough to move on from this given time. The boy has a lot of emotions he gonna have to work through. Hound Dog said as he looked to his co-workers. Feelings of betrayal are not something a person just gets over overnight. What do you suggest? A lot. Hound Dog said with a sigh. But first and foremost, get used to the idea of him never forgiving us. Even if Izuku finds a way to move past this, it's not his responsibility to make us feel better by forgiving us. I think you're overselling this slightly. Vlad said as he looked to the rest of his co-workers and friends. Sure, we screwed up. We fucked up majorly. I'll be the first one to admit that. But that doesn't mean it's the end of the world here. What do you suggest we do? Cementos said, voicing his opinion for the first time since hearing the news. Pretend this didn't happen. Of course not, Vlad said, sounding almost offended by the words. We try our damnedest to make up for our mistakes and move on. That's rich coming from you, Snipe said as he looked to the larger man. But, unfortunately, not everyone here is responsible for spreading this to the rest of the student body. Shota cringed at the accusation but couldn't outright disagree with the barb. Vlad hadn't been as discreet as maybe he should have been when discussing the possible mole in UA with his students. Monoma had taken it upon himself to warn the rest of the general studies and business classes about Izuku's possible involvement with the League. I'll speak to my students as soon as this meeting is over. Vlad said, embarrassment and regret radiating off his face. Then, I'll sit Niato down personally and explain to him what he did was unacceptable. The damage has already been done, Midnight said, her voice regaining some of its usual volume but none of its characteristic luster. We can talk about what we can do to minimize the damage we caused, but it doesn't matter. Don't say that. Present Mike said, almost desperate to believe his own words as he spoke. We could. Let's be honest with ourselves. Midnight said as she stood up from her seat. I don't think I could forgive any of you if I found out you've been sharing personal details about my life to some gossip magazine. Let alone the Hero Commission. We tried to put him in prison, the 18-plus hero shouted, her words cracking slightly from the volume of her voice. This isn't something people forget about. Nor should it be. She's right, you know. Hound Dog said, his voice subdued. Something like this? It changes a person. This kid just had his entire support structure ripped out from under him. He was treated like a pariah and a leper by his friends and people he respected. The Hound Hero's voice drifted as the door to the conference room was flung open with a surprising amount of force. As All Might walked through the threshold. Not emaciated Toshinori Yagi, All Might. All Might was standing in the aisle, the hand grasping the open door cracking and warping the door frame, and he was not smiling. The former number 1 hero turned towards the pro heroes, looking at his fellow teachers with utter disdain in his eyes as he took a step forward. All Might hadn't said a word since entering, but his anger was almost palpable in the air. You. He cut the distance between him and Eraserhead in a single stride, wrapping one of his baseball mitt-sized hands around Aizawa's neck and lifting him off the ground. Get your hands off of him, All Might! Vlad King shouted at the Titan before him, placing his hand against All Might's arm in an attempt to separate the two men. A shrug of the shoulders was all it took to throw the 1B homeroom teacher clear across the room. How was All Might doing this? How was he still so strong? He shouldn't have been able to keep muscle form up for more than a couple of seconds. The room's residents looked on in shock as the usually gentle and kind-hearted man utterly manhandled Shouta. But what could they do? Who had a chance of stopping All Might if he genuinely wanted to do something? You almost dismissed my student the first day of school for not having what it took to be a hero. All Might shouted Aizawa down, the eraser hero stilling as he heard the words. You almost expelled Midoriya for not meeting your standards, and you do this. Shouta said nothing. Even if he wanted to, how could he say anything as the vice-like grip held him in place? He had always seen All Might as a bit of a clown, someone who showcased the very worst of heroics. But seeing him now? Seeing the righteous fury in his eyes up close, with the knowledge that he was on the wrong end of the symbol of peace? He could understand just what it was like to have All Might as an enemy. You are not worthy enough to call yourself a hero. You have no right to call yourself a teacher. And you have no right to treat Midoriya like he was a villain. All Might reared his right fist back. Texas. No, don't. You'll kill him. He ignored them as he threw his massive fist towards the underground hero with inhuman speed. Smash. Eraserhead staggered away from the punch as he was dropped, losing his balance and falling backward. There was a slight pain in his cheek, but it stung more than it hurt. He looked up at the source. All Might had deflated to his proper form at the moment just before impact, and the former pro looked down at him with contempt. Shota's eyes widened. Even powerless and emaciated, All Might had a presence and a power of character that demanded both respect and fear. You're lucky, Yagi said through clenched teeth, giving the blood spurting from his weakened body no mind as he glared at the assembled teachers before him. You're all lucky. The former number 1 hero turned to walk away, not saying another word as he walked down the hall. The room was silent once more as Shota pulled himself back up to his feet. A small part of him almost wishing the former pro had enough gas left in his tank to put him out of his misery. Mina looked around the common room. The remnants of Class A were scattered across the room, isolated and alone as they ignored one another. Zero passed Denki in the hall, the close friends not even making eye contact with one another as they both seemed lost in their own thoughts. Not that Mina could blame them anyway. Sato was still in the kitchen. When stressed, his baking habit took to the extreme as he prepared yet another chocolate creation he would refuse to eat. Now that Mina thought about it, she hadn't seen anyone eat anything since last night. Mineta and Ajiro sat silently flipping through channels on the TV without so much as a pause. They both stared off into the void with a hollow look on their faces for the past few hours. Neither of them looking like they would be done anytime soon. Okako was still in her room crying. Each of the girls had volunteered to spend the night with her. Something, in retrospect, possibly made Mina feel even worse. Watching a girl have her heart utterly broken was something Mina didn't want to ever see again. It had been less than a day since they were told the truth, and already their class had shattered. A far cry from the chaotic carnival of noise their dorm usually was only a few weeks ago. Their class had been a family. Then it wasn't. It all started when the teachers told them the unthinkable. Midoriya was suspected to be a spy for the League of Villains. Mina cringed at the thought of it, the desire to throw up increasing with each passing second. But had that been all it took for their class to tear itself apart? None of them wanted to believe it. But the proof was right there. Izuku had been born quirkless. He had lived without a quirk for the first 15 years of his life. Katsuki had attested to it. The medical records shown to them had attested to it. How can someone obtain not just one but multiple quirks like Izuku had done in such a short amount of time? It didn't make sense. Until the monster from Kamino appeared. All for One had been the man behind the League of Villains. The man who organized their attempted murders multiple times. The man who wielded the frightening power to steal and bestow quirks to anyone he so chooses, and the man who hanged over them more and more with each passing day. It all made so much sense to Mina. The villains were putting effort into isolating Izuku from the rest of the class during fights. Izuku's habit of always throwing himself into the thick of danger. Izuku's sudden powers and his habits of writing everything down whenever he had the chance. Mina stifled a sob. She guessed those middle school bullies were right about her, after all. She really was as stupid as they thought she was to go along with this. Hey, if you got a problem with me, say to my face or fuck off to someone who cares. The quiet was broken by the sound of Bakugo from the kitchen. Mina felt her skin crawl by what had become the new normal for her class. Bro, what's your problem? Kirishima shouted back, his posture tense as he stared at Bakugo with a disdain Mina had never seen on her horn buddy's face before today. Why do you have to be such an asshole to everyone? What did you just say? Bakugo said in a dangerous tone, getting up from the table. Bakugo had changed seemingly overnight after their teacher had spoken to them. If it was possible, he became angrier and more aggressive than he was before. Still, even then, his demeanor became something darker. He had always been fierce, but for whatever insult he threw, there was strange humor and wit with how he threw it. Most of the time, he didn't actually want to hurt anyone's feelings. It was just mocking, and ribbing others was how someone like Katsuki communicated. But something about this whole ordeal had changed him. Bakugo had always made comments against Midoriya during this ordeal that left a bad taste in her mouth. But after their teachers had told them of his possible betrayal, it had gotten even worse. She figured it was the added betrayal Katsuki felt for the boy he had known since childhood working with villains. The same criminals had kidnapped him. But now? All the hatred and hostility were being directed towards everyone and everything that crossed his path. How did Midori take this for this long? The Bakugo in front of her looked almost deranged. The manic look on his face promised a fight, and Kiri, despite his better judgment, was looking for the same. Mina grimaced as she watched the scene unfold. The two boys looked to be just about ready to start throwing punches at one another at any time. The class had been at each other's throats all day. Whatever anger and self-loathing bubbling over until it became unbearable. It was only then that Ida spoke. Fighting on school grounds is unacceptable. As is speaking disgracefully of your peers. I insist you stop, he said in a quiet tone. He glared at Bakugo. Oh yeah. Bakugo said, getting into the taller teenager's face, what are you gonna do about it, huh? Before Ida could respond, either with a punch or with words, a single wall of ice separated the two as Shoto stepped into the common room for the first time that day. Even more so than the others, he looked like a wreck with dark bags under his eyes and tarnishing his pale features. He looked like he hadn't slept all night. She could relate. Is this how you treat each other after everything we've already done? His voice was quiet but steady. The words vibrating against the walls of the room, and making everyone seemingly wake up from their comas. Maybe instead of getting angry with one another, you think of ways we can fix what we broke. Ida looked guilty, looking away from his fellow students watching the unfolding scene, before taking a step away from Bakugo and the ice wall. Bakugo froze, and for a moment, Mina assumed the explosion user would direct his anger at Shoto. But Mina was surprised to see that Bakugo walked away, his rage deflating with each step he took. He didn't say a word as he ascended the staircase to his room, the two-toned hero following him silently. Mina let go of the breath she didn't know she was holding as she took stock of the room. Those who remained in the common room looked to where Shoto once stood, their own minds racing from his words. Kiri walked towards the couches and threw himself down almost lazily as he leaned back against the cushions. Mina moved closer to her friend and placed a hand on his shoulder. He stiffened but relaxed when he saw it was her. Whatever anger filled his body when he was with Bakugo had long since disappeared, replaced with an utter numbness. Mina leaned into the redhead's shoulder, wrapping her arms around him, and squeezed. The unspoken words shared between them giving little comfort to one another as they simply sat and held each other in silence. Kinj explosion murder, listen here, nerd. Kinj explosion murder, you better come back to class, or you're gonna regret it. Kinj explosion murder, are you waiting for me to apologize? Kinj explosion murder, I ask that what you want. Fine. Kinj explosion murder, I'm sorry for everything I have ever done to you. Kinj explosion murder, I regret everything bad I've ever said to you and everything bad I've ever done to you. Kinj explosion murder, are you happy, DEKU? Message cannot be sent. Kinji explosion murder, deku. When Shota arrived, Nedza was sitting quietly in his office. Gone was the manic gleam in his eyes, replaced with a neutral look that made his small black eyes seem unnatural. His paws joined together, and Shota could tell he had been wringing his hands together before he had arrived. This wasn't the intense state of concentration that many of Nedza's quieter moments could be described as. Moments of isolation and quiet contemplation where the thirst for knowledge or the desire to crack a puzzle made the small principal shun those around him until the problem was solved. An intense aura of resignation had surrounded him. Shota was reminded of a man who had just been told he had been diagnosed with cancer and had only been given a few months to live. Then forced to sit there, and quietly learn to accept the inevitable. What happened? The principal looked up at him. His small eyes were even darker than usual. Midoriya is requesting to transfer to another school. It was as if someone had shot Shota. Aizawa sat down to the offered chair in front of Nedza quickly to avoid collapsing if he stood any longer. Midoriya. If he were to leave. Shota folded in on himself. But, of course, this was all his fault. If he hadn't told his students, if he hadn't shared his thoughts to his co-workers, if he hadn't spoken to the commission. If he hadn't excluded All Might and Nizu from his plans. If he had trusted his student. He hasn't announced which school he plans on transferring. However, his mother had made it clear he plans on taking the rest of the semester off before starting this second year away from UA. Let me talk to him. I know why he is doing this, but he is a reasonable kid. We can find a solution. Unfortunately, this is too late. Mr. Midoriya's resignation letter was left on my desk by All Might. As you know, young Midoriya hasn't been on campus since the commission took him out of class. His mother is setting up an appointment to have his things delivered to their home. Shota remembered Midoriya's bland look in the car ride from the police department. Had the boy already made his decision then? Was he already too late to fix his mistakes? Was this how it ended? Unfortunately, that's not all. Shota didn't bother tempting fate in saying that nothing could get worse than a student leaving them because he was utterly disappointed in their behavior. All Might has resigned his position. Effective immediately. Several months later. Everything felt heavy. Like he was an immense weight sinking to the bottom of the ocean. It reminded him of the sludge villain attack 2 years ago. Had it been that long already? It felt a lifetime ago and just the other day almost simultaneously. The feeling of drowning on solid ground was something one doesn't forget. Every once in a while, Izuku felt like he would bob to the surface for fresh air before he was pulled back. He was able to hear the sounds of the outside world and knew he wasn't actually alone wherever he was. He thought it was over at those moments before everything crashed around him, and he felt he was being burned alive. Sometimes he could hear a calming voice, but everything was too muffled for him to understand. It gave him a lot of time to think. And then suddenly, he was in a hospital room. It was an outcome he expected if the last thing he remembered was true, if he was honest. Either that or end up dead, but he didn't think he'd have so much time to think about stuff if he had actually died. Midoriya tried to lift his arm to rub the sleep out of his eyes, but he felt nothing happen. Instead, he felt his heart rate pick up as he went to peek at his right side, the arm that delivered the final blow to All for One. He let out a soft sigh of relief when he saw the cast and bandages. He honestly thought that he had finally managed to blow one of his limbs up after everything had happened. But, instead, his gaze shifted back to his left side, seeing his mother sitting in a chair next to his bed. Her head was propped up by the wall, and she was softly snoring. "My boy!" All Might shouted as he closed the lone door to the room holding what looked like 2 cups of coffee. He moved quick, almost dropping the cups to the ground as he did so. "We were worried about you. You're awake," his mother exclaimed as she was awoken from her sleep by his mentor's rather clumsy and thunderous footsteps. The woman almost falling over to wrap her arms around his shoulders into a hug as gingerly as she could. His mother was not a physically strong woman, but for the first time since the war with All for One had started, he felt genuinely safe. "I'm glad you're awake." Midoriya wrapped his arms around his mother, feeling tears well up in his eyes, knowing he was the cause of his mother's current condition. "What about Dash?" His voice had cracked, breaking off the rest of his question. Luckily, his mentor was already by his side with a glass of water. "Drink," he said, pushing the glass against Midoriya's lips. Midoriya murmured his thanks as he took his first few sips, the refreshing chill of the water making his raw throat burn. "What happened?" It's over, my boy. All Might whispered as he put his hand on the boy's shoulder, it's finally over. And Shigaraki? Izuku said as he pushed himself up or tried to anyway before his now awake and worried mother forced him back down. What happened to him? Dead. The former pro-hero said. Izuku could tell his mentor was conflicted when it came to the former villain. Shigaraki had showcased the worst of humanity. All of its pettiness and rage. With a thirst for vengeance and violence that threatened to end the whole of Japan if he was left unchecked. But at the same time, he was just an angry child who had been morphed and manipulated into becoming a weapon by a monster. But, in the end, he was also the man who had sacrificed his own life to defeat All For One once and for all. Izuku couldn't help but feel a bit conflicted at the thought as well. Could a good deed erase the bad a person had done in their lives? Izuku. His mother quietly said off to his side, a small smile on her face as she looked at him with a feeling he could never remember seeing in her deep green eyes. Your friends. Your classmates, your former classmates are all here waiting to see you. All Might said, the iron in his voice surprising Izuku somewhat when he heard it. I told them to leave, but it seems they didn't take my words as seriously as they should have. Izuku looked towards his mother, seeing her sad smile illuminated under her dark and baggy eyes. She could always read him like a book, and despite everything he had done, he still couldn't lie to save his life. Izuku steeled himself. He hadn't spoken to his classmates since he had unofficially left UA. However, the onset of the war with the Paranormal Liberation Front had put a stall on normal functions of the prestigious institution. Nevertheless, if the rumors he had heard from Endeavor were correct, he was still on the slated roster of Class 2A that would begin this fall. Izuku was conflicted about that too. But he was learning to get used to these conflicted feelings. Are you sure, Izuku? All Might said as he turned back to his student. But, of course, no one would blame you if you decided not to. Izuku stared up to the ceiling, the bright forensic lights humming softly and giving him an odd numbing feeling to his body. Or maybe that was all the painkillers he was on. Perhaps he was so drugged up on morphine and oxycodone that his mind wasn't acting as it should. But his body always had a habit of moving on its own when he knew people were suffering. I think, Izuku said, his thoughts drifting to Shigaraka's broken body, crying out for his mother as All For One took absolute control. The image of Toga's bloodied body being carted off for medical attention. The sight of Stain's smiling corpse after he threw himself to save Izuku's own life from All For One's attack. People shouldn't be judged solely on their worst days. For a moment, Izuku sat alone, half dreading the sound of so many footsteps coming to greet him. He thought he would feel a perverse pleasure run through his veins at the thought of his former friends throwing themselves at his feet and begging for forgiveness. He'd be lying if he said the thought never crossed his mind. But after everything that had happened, a part of him just wants to move on. Letting the darkness linger would allow it to fester in him, to change him into something he didn't want to be. Like it did to Shigaraki and so many others. He could never forget, but maybe he can forgive. It may never be the same. In fact, Izuku was sure it would never be the same. Whatever relationship he had was gone. But he wasn't gonna let this ruin what kind of person Izuku was. But then, a knock on the door broke him out of his thoughts. Come in. Izuku stood motionless against the tree, simply waiting. He did not want to be here, but the circumstances around his student had made him do a lot of things he didn't want to do. An icy cold feeling enveloped his chest as he saw the figure leave the front door of the Heights Alliance dorm room. Right on time. Shota thought to himself as he met the figure in the underbrush, using the shadows from the trees as cover as he did. Were you followed? The homeroom teacher asked, his eyes narrowed at the shorter figure. No. Hitachi Shinso said, his eyes darting back and forth from his mentor and the building he had just left. I made sure of it. Shoten nodded his head. He shouldn't question the kid or his abilities. But in situations like this, Shota found that he'd rather be safe than sorry. Did you get it? He asked, watching the teenager before him cringe and grimace at the question. Shoten knew this was a lot to ask for someone so young. But, in actuality, if this was any other time for any other circumstance, Shota would rather cut off his own limb before he dragged someone so young into this. But, if what the commission told him was true, the fact that they too have been looking into Midoriya since before the school year officially started. So Shoten needed to rip the bandage off as soon as he could. And Hitachi had just the right skill and mindset to do just that. Yeah, the purple-haired student said, handing his mentor the plain-looking notebook he kept hidden in his jacket pocket. I had to use my quirk on him to get him to give this to me. It made sense for Midoriya to be protective of his notebooks if they contained what they theorized they contained. The fact that Hitachi had to use his quirk was concerning, however. If Midoriya knew. Don't worry. I told Izuku to forget he saw me today. Hitachi said, seeing the concern in Izuku's face. By the time he wakes up tomorrow morning, he'll be none the wiser. Good thinking, the underground hero said as he pocketed the notebook. You think on your feet. That's the mark of a good hero. Despite the words of praise, Hitachi still looked uncomfortable. He looked up one of the many windows of the dorm building, a specific one on the 3rd floor. He looked thoughtful for a moment, but before Izuku could do or say anything, the boy spoke again. Is Midoriya really working for the League of Villains? Hitachi said, his voice quiet, but his tone was solemn as he looked at him. This was not what he had expected, and if more than just his own students knew of his suspicions, who knew who else did? He couldn't be sure how much longer they could keep this under wraps if this went on any longer. Who told you that? Shota said, trying to maintain deniability. The worst thing that could happen to any fact-finding operation was more people who knew of its existence than needed to. This was just a test of your infiltration skills. Don't lie to me. Most of the students in Gen Ed have heard the same rumors. Everyone is saying it's Midoriya, the purple-haired Gen Ed student said, his voice deadly serious as his eyes bore into Shota's own. Is it true? The teen looked at him with a strange look on his face. For once Shota found he didn't know what to say at the moment. On the one hand, the first rule underground heroes followed regarding their informants was to continually give them plausible deniability regarding what they knew and what they didn't. But on the other hand, the kid had already played a part in this investigation. Having students do his dirty work was already something that already crossed one of the many lines Shota had made during his career. This was what Hitachi was training for. The world of underground heroics was not for the faint of heart. The kid deserved to know. Yes, Shota said simply, the idea of his own student being a mole was painful to admit, especially to another student. But too many things had come together for the outcome to be anything else. I'm afraid so. Hitachi didn't say anything, but his face told a story. A story of betrayal and disgust, of disbelief turning into acceptance. Looks he had seen on every single one of his students eventually. The boy turned to walk away from Shota and towards the dorm of the general studies classes. His posture was rigid, but Shota could tell that something had changed for Hitachi. He turned to look at Shota, his face illuminated by the night sky. The boy looked tired and at odds with himself, but he looked like he was trying to hide it. Since I helped take down the UA traitor. The purple-haired student said with a smirk that didn't hide the hurt in his tired eyes. Guess there's gonna be an open spot in your class next year, right? Izuku sat motionless in the chair, waiting for something to happen. Nezu silently sipped at his tea without giving a single indication of what was on his mind. Izuku knew something important was happening, but for the life of him, he couldn't fathom what had caused Nezu to call him to his office so early in the morning. Izuku felt a bolt of pain shoot down his leg or where his leg used to be as he gripped the prosthetic limb in his hands to readjust it. He didn't think he'd quite get used to his missing limb, but it was the reality he found himself in. There were many things about his life now that he didn't like that he needed to accept. He's not the traitor. Shota closed his eyes, willing the tears and bad memories away from him as he did so. Even after so many months, the pain of his failure still felt so raw to him. The boy who had saved the world. The same boy who had almost sacrificed himself to put an end to Shigaraki and the League of Villains, the boy who was still in a medically induced coma and who may never wake up again. He had thought that same boy was a villain. The pain clawed at Shota's chest like someone had dug an ice pick into his heart when he wasn't looking. This, too, was a feeling Shota would need to get used to. The feeling of failing someone who trusted him. It felt like Oboro all over again. You must be wondering why I called you here this morning. Nezu finally said. His morose voice contained a sliver of its usual energy as he looked at Shota with a gleam in his eyes that Shota almost forgot existed. With everything that has happened these few months, I find it best to have a quiet moment to reflect before each new chapter in life can be appreciated. Shota stared at the UA headmaster with indifference, ignoring the steaming cup of tea he was offered when he sat down. He knew that Nezu was planning something, but for the life of him, Shota couldn't figure what. A knock broke him out of his thoughts as Nezu called for whoever was behind the door to enter. Shouta could imagine any number of people that could have been behind those doors. Lunch rush with a list of supplies needed for the coming school year. Hound dog barking up a storm about the new security measures in place. But seeing all might of people was the last thing he expected to see today. He hadn't spoken to the man since before the war with All for One had started. He hadn't even been in the same room as the man since the former hero had assaulted him in the teacher's lounge in what felt like a lifetime ago. Yet, the man's skinny frame did nothing to belay the seriousness of his expression as he almost glided over the floor towards the empty chair in front of Nedzu's desk. The towering former hero raised the handkerchief to his mouth to cover a cough as he tried his best to ignore Aizawa's presence. The skeletal man looked even more ragged and sickly than he did the last time Shouta saw him. However, he still managed to stand tall despite his condition. Shouta eyed the man's hands, remembering back to the fear he felt when that baseball mitt-sized appendage was about to crash into his face. "Thank you for inviting me, Nedzu," the former number one said as he sat down. He continued to pointedly ignore Aizawa as he did so, not that Shouta blamed him. "We have much to discuss regarding young Midoriya." Shouta felt his whole body tense with energy and dread he could barely describe in words as if by magic or some form of science gone wrong. "Midoriya? What about Midoriya? Had something happened to the boy? Was he okay? Why were they all here instead of with him right now?" His emotions must have been visible on his features as Nedzu raised a paw to calm him down and force him back to his seat. He hadn't even realized he had been standing until he saw the guarded stare of All Might staring up towards him, silently judging him. Where was this when he was accused of being a villain? Shouta shrunk into his chair, almost defeated as his newfound energy and concern were sapped away from the dark thoughts that filled his mind once more. "Thank you for coming. I know that you were quite adamant about never returning here the last time we spoke on the subject. Still, it seems some unfortunate circumstances have forced our hands," Nedzu said as he clasped his paws together. This was not the first time the two had spoken to one another since All Might resigned his position, that much Shouta knew. What he didn't realize was just how much the two had said to one another in the last few months. Nedzu had been far too tight-lipped about the subject, far more so than he usually would have been, but Shouta couldn't be surprised about it if he was honest with himself. He doubted his employer trusted him as much as he might have before all this. "What is this about?" Shouta said, his curiosity beating out his internal loathing at the moment. "Why is All Might here? And why am I here?" Nedzu stared at him for a moment before his small eyes drifted to the form of the tallest man in the room. All Might, for his part, looked uncomfortable, but that was only because the barely held anger had been kept at bay out of respect for Nedzu. "Despite the best of my abilities," All Might said with a clench of his jaw, Shouta almost hearing the grinding of teeth as he did so. "So, unfortunately, it seems my boy will be forced to return to UA to finish his education." The world seemed to freeze as Aizawa felt his entire body seize up in shock. Had he heard that right? Thoughts raced through his mind a mile a second as he came to terms with the reality of the situation. Izuka was coming back to them. Why? The word left Aizawa's mouth before he could do anything to stop it. The logical part of his mind trying to cling to anything that could prove that this was not another fevered fantasy of his mind. All Might clenched his jaw and flexed his hands, the joints cracking from the action before he stood up and walked to the window overlooking the courtyard. All Might was angry, but Shouta was relieved to notice the righteous fury was not directed at him as All Might stared hard out the window. "I spoke with several associates overseas regarding young Midoriya's training and education. As you could imagine, my name still holds some weight with several circles." All Might said the vision of his face reflected off the glass of the window did little to soothe Shouta. "I was happy to announce to Izuka when he awakes that he would have his pick of any heroics academy in the world." Shouta nodded his head. Even retired All Might's word went a long way and carried a lot of weight. Everywhere from my island to the Xavier Institute would have gladly opened their doors for someone like Izuku. Now, with Izuku's newly gained reputation, every single heroic institution on the planet would be falling over themselves, trying to gain Izuku's transfer. The world indeed would have been at the boy's fingertips. My boy was set to receive a full scholarship to one of many heroics schools in the United States. All Might trailed off, his voice becoming harder as his thin face became like a stone. Until the Heroic Commission got involved. It seems the Heroics Commission doesn't want the scandal of having its national hero choose to pursue a hero career outside of Japan, Nedzu said, placing his teacup back down on the table. Even on the brink of societal collapse, the HPSC will do anything in its power to ensure its survival. It was a well-known secret that the public opinion of the HPSC and heroes, in general, was at an all-time low during the war. The well-published scandals of Endeavor alone would have been a tough pill for the public to swallow. Still, dozens of high-profile heroes retiring in disgrace out of fear of All for One's forces and even more heroes dying trying to maintain a semblance of order on the streets had all but decimated public opinion over the months. Izuku had been one of the only ones who had been able to keep the world sane enough to survive the chaos long enough for All for One to be defeated. He was already being primed by some as the next #1 hero when he officially debuted. "They are using my boy as a political bargaining chip," All Might said, the level of malice and disgust in his voice enough to shock Shota where he Saturday, the government issued emergency war powers to keep all licensed heroes on Japanese soil until the state of emergency is over with the remnants of All for One's influence wiped clean. "That could take months," Shota said, his mind already seeing the writing on the wall as to the Commission's actions. "Years even. If we are lucky." All Might said seriously, his voice sounding tired as if decades of hero work and months of constant fighting had all caught up to him at once. "He can fight it, sure. He's not officially a hero yet. He might even win in the end. But the Commission will drag its heels in the mud for years." The room was silent as All Might's words hung in the air. Izuku's entire heroics career would be stopped in its tracks before officially starting if he got stuck in the international courts. His prime years would be wasted on meaningless bureaucracy over the pettiness of the HPSA and its remaining leadership. "That's why you're staying in Japan," Shota said, his voice quiet as he worked up his nerve. "But why UA?" "That it seems is an unfortunate consequence of the current climate of heroics in this country," Nedzu said. The usual cheeriness that had seeped into his voice since the meeting had started was gone. Many of the smaller hero schools in Japan had been taken over by the HPSC directly, while others like Shikatsu have managed to keep their independence. Its resources had been stretched to its limits, accommodating the large influx of civilians displaced by All for One. Of course, he had heard rumors of such, but hearing it from Nedzu had made the situation feel that much more real to Shota. UA was one of the few hero schools that managed to escape the war as well as it did. No, in small thanks to Nedzu's leadership as well as other outside factors. Hero society moving forward would forever be changed. But despite the dire situation, Aozawa felt hope fill his chest for the first time in a long time. "As much as I hate to admit this," All Might said as he turned to look at Nedzu and Shota. "Unfortunately, UA is possibly the only choice we have for Izuku to finish his schooling on time." Shota released a breath he didn't know he was holding as he leaned back into his chair. Although, of course, UA wasn't their first choice, UA had to have been their only choice if All Might willingly choose to come here. But even so, Shota felt his chest become lighter. Like a great weight, he had been carrying had been lifted off him. However, given how Izuku had been treated before he requested his transfer, All Might spoke, his tone filled with dangerous intent as he stared at Shota. "I have several demands before I can sign off on young Midoriya's return." The room stilled, and for a moment, Izuku found himself dreading the words that were about to leave the man's mouth. "Of course. I can understand that we as an institution," Nedzu said, leaving the fact that he too had been lied to and kept in the dark for most of the traitor talk unsaid. The fact he ignored the rumors spreading about Izuku for so long, weighing heavy on his conscience, has failed him in the past. "We shall do our best to put whatever ill feelings at ease as best we can. Izuku will not be a member of Class 2A." All Might said simply, his tone leaving no room for arguments and leaving Shota feeling like he had been punched in the gut. While remaining a student of the heroics course, he will instead join the general education course students in all non-hero related classes. Shota felt his hands grip the arm of the chair he sat on. He grabbed it so hard he felt the wood whine and give from his effort. Furthermore, while he must train alongside his former classmates for sparring and group training exercises, each other related class will be supervised by either myself or Gran Torino. "I won't allow this," Shota said, his voice barely above his usual baritone but conveying more steel than it had for weeks. This was his chance to make things right, and he wouldn't let All Might. "You don't have the right to an opinion on this," All Might shouted, so distracted by his own rage, he ignored the blood that seeped from his mouth. "Not after what you did." Shota felt the pain in his chest return as he watched All Might raise the bloodied handkerchief back to his mouth. The shame of seeing someone else act the way he knew now he should have been towards Izuku was almost too much for him to bear. Nedza thankfully took the attention back towards him with a nod of his head. What else would you need, All Might? The small principal questioned, his eye regaining some of its usual lusters as his mind worked feverishly to come up with the logistics of Midoriya's unique school schedule. All Might readjusted his coat as he took a deep breath to calm his nerves, but the look in his eyes showed that the anger towards Ozawa had yet to leave him entirely. My boy will not be staying at the dorms. He will commute the same way he commuted at the beginning of his first year. All Might said, his voice brokering no room for argument. We wish to avoid any unneeded confrontations with specific members of the staff or student body. He also wanted to remain close to his mother. The poor woman had suffered greatly due to stress during these past few months. Izuku does not want to further stress her. Shota smiled but hid it under his scarf. That sounded like something Izuku would do. While much of the public transportation had been damaged, he had a suspicion that the hassle of going back and forth every day was worth the added comfort for his mother. While he knew the rest of his students would bemoan not sharing a dorm with Midoriya, even they would understand his reasoning. Thirdly, Gran Torino and I will act as Izuku's primary trainers while on campus. While we will not refuse to help any student who seeks us out for advice, our focus on campus will be Izuku's development. Agreed. Nedza said, his clasped hands, hiding the small smile that his eyes showed was on his face. These are suitable demands, and ones that will be easy to accommodate. The small principal looked towards Shota, his small black eyes bearing into Shota's soul. But despite everything, Shota could only nod his head in affirmation. This was a small price to pay for the chance to fix his mistakes. To try and make up for the hell he had caused. He looked at All Might, the towering figure looking back. Baby steps were the best he could hope for after all. Katsuki wasn't fucking stupid. Not by a fucking long shot. As much as people, especially the extras in his life, liked to look down on him as a flashy quirk without the intelligence or skill to use it, nothing could be further from the truth. Katsuki hadn't worked his entire life to get to this point just to let a bunch of no-named losers think he was all brawn and no brain. So, to think that Deku, of all people, would think so little of him to believe Katsuki wouldn't see right through whatever bullshit he was trying to pull was laughable. The two of them had known each other since birth. Their mothers had made a childhood without the other in their lives a near impossibility. Deku may like to pretend he was some sort of "aw shucks goody two-shoes" whenever he was with the rest of the extras in their class, but Katsuki knew the real Deku. The Deku that the green-haired boy tried his best to hide whenever he was with his new friends. But Katsuki knew. Katsuki felt his rage bubble over as he stared at the eyes of his green-haired classmate. Belittlement. Pity. The mocking arrogance of a boy who had nothing but who thought he was as good as Katsuki. A boy who would have done anything to become a hero. But even Katsuki couldn't imagine he would go this far. Kakan. Deku said softly as he took a step towards him. You're freaking me out a little bit. How could Katsuki have been this stupid? Did it really take him getting kidnapped to see the truth that had been staring at him the entire year? Get away from me, you stupid creep. Bakugo exploded, his red eyes ablaze with the righteous fury he felt in his very soul. I don't want you anywhere near me. They stood alone on the training ground. The night was cold and dark, but Katsuki didn't care all too much. All he cared was of the figure staring at him with those fake kind eyes that had deceived him. Katsuki ground his teeth at the thought. Those eyes had been tricking him his entire life, he realized the more he thought about it. The same eyes that had watched him since childhood, planning and plotting for the perfect moment to strike. He should have known. The boy would have done anything to be a hero. Even if it meant going to a villain to do it. He had been so stupid. Deku had practically admitted it to him their first week of school. He had gotten a quirk from someone else. He was using someone else's quirk. None of it made any sense. Then he was kidnapped. He remembered how some of the extras thought a traitor was working for the villains, like a mole or something out of some shitty manga. He remembered thinking how it was all nothing but bullshit, just a bunch of extras making excuses for their lack of skill. But then everything started to fit together. How could he let himself fall into a trap set by a bunch of 2-bit villains? He was better than that. But, unfortunately, it was like they knew just how to get to him, just how his quirk worked, and just where he would be to kidnap him. There was no other explanation for it. Someone was helping them. Someone who knew more about how Katsuki fought and how his quirk worked than Katsuki did himself. Someone who always managed to get himself the attention of the big fish villains despite being a side character at best. I'm serious, Kukin. Deku lowered his hands, trying to make himself seem less like the threat he is and more like the weak nerd he pretended he was. You look like you're about to burst. Why don't we head back to the dorms and calm? Katsuki flashed his open palm towards the traitor, an explosion ripping through the air and forcing the green-haired boy backward. I said to stay away from me, you fucking loser. How long had Deku been working against them? The sludge villain, was that what got their attention? Some dumb fucking middle schooler almost getting himself killed trying to play at being a hero? That made perfect fucking sense. He remembered Deku being entirely out of it their last year at Aldera. Kukin. Deku said as he raised his hands up to placate him. Like that would fucking work. Just tell me what's wrong, and we can work to fix it. Fix it? Katsuki thought to himself. Fix it. Katsuki felt himself growl again, a guttural and primal sound leaving his throat. So the boy who had sold him out to the League of Villains wanted to fix this? So the boy who had tried to get the monster of Kamino, the beast who ended All Might's career to steal Katsuki's quirk, wanted to pretend he was in the right this whole time? Katsuki knew that he was the hero of this story, the one destined to become the greatest hero the world had ever seen and the one to surpass even All Might. What hero doesn't have his greatest opponent betray him for their own personal gain? Only a true villain would have allowed All Might to retire the way he did. Deku had let him think that it was all Kazuki's fault for being captured. Deku would let Katsuki live with the idea that he was the boy All Might had thrown his life as a hero away to save when he was the one to help put him in that situation. Deku. Katsuki roared, his hands already ablaze with a fury he had never felt before. It's all your fault. Katsuki Bakugo walked silently down the sidewalk, ignoring the stairs as he headed towards the UA campus. It was the uniform, he rationalized, that made him stand out so much. People tended to look at hero students and heroes in general differently after the war against the Paranormal Liberation Army. They were standoffish, viewing him less like someone to look up to and more like someone to be wary of. That was something that would take a while to return to some level of normalcy. The city of Musutafu had been in rough shape. While not as bad as the havoc and destruction of Tokyo or Osaka, it was still hard to see the neighborhood he had lived his entire life in such a poor state of repair. City blocks had been carved and gutted, power lines and electric cables dangled low to the ground like dead snakes. The army of relief and construction workers littered the streets, trying to clean up the festering wounds the Paranormal Liberation Army had created. But Katsuki had a feeling that a sense of normalcy was far away if all he saw was the aftermath around him. Katsuki ignored some little first-year extra, trying to be subtle as he stared at him. He was either trying to size up the upperclassmen he would be forced to deal with at UA, or he was yet another person who recognized his face. The winner of last year's UA Sports Festival. The boy All Might be saved from the monster of Kamino. But for the life of Katsuki, he couldn't find it in him to care all too much. His mind was on more important things right now. Midoriya hasn't been at the dorms yet. Shitty Hair had texted him last night. The apparent concern and confusion evident in the brief words that shone from his phone screen. Have you heard anything from him? He hadn't talked to Deku since the hospital visit last week. Not that he didn't want to, he just couldn't find the nerve to type something out or to dial his number. A part of him was scared that despite saying he forgave them when he woke up in the hospital, he wouldn't pick up the phone if Katsuki had called him. But Katsuki was even more afraid if Deku did actually pick up the phone. What would he say? What could he say? Hey Deku, it's me, the dude who played a part in ruining your life for the past decade and wished for your death. Want to catch a movie with the guys? Katsuki almost cringed at the thought. There was a right way and a wrong way to get into Deku's good graces. Bombarding the guy out of the blue and not giving him the time to rest after getting discharged from the hospital, was not it. At least Katsuki hoped not. He didn't want to fuck up this second chance before it actually started. He turned the corner of the street, his eyes widening at the sight of green curls atop an identical uniform to the one he wore. Deku was here? Should he say something? But he couldn't, not right now. He had frozen when he was in the hospital room, only managing to numbly look at the boy he had grown up with when the rest of their class had literally spilled their guts to him. While they all laid their sins down at his feet and begged for forgiveness. Katsuki said nothing. He was too busy staring at Deku's limbs. The broken appendages were barely kept together by plaster and wraps. The scars and cuts covering his visible body were primarily fresh and raw, but some looked old and familiar. Some he knew he was the cause of. But it was the charred and blackened skin on his throat that made Katsuki want to throw up. One of decayed and dead flesh the size and shape of a hand wrapping around his neck. The only reason Deku had that scar was because he was out there on his own. He didn't have anyone to look out for him the way he should have had. The only reason Deku had that scar was because of him. Fuck it. Hey, Deku, wait up. Katsuki shouted, rushing towards the now stopped figure in front of him, stopping just a meter or so away. When the hell did Deku get this tall? The boy had always been on the small size. Even after bulking up and putting on dozens of pounds of muscle, he was still one of the shorter guys in class. Only Bird Brain and the Grape Midget were shorter than him. But the figure in front of him towered over Katsuki, not just in height but in width. Was he this huge in the hospital? Oh hey, Bakugo. Izuku said, a small smile on his face, but not one that reached his eyes. I guess you're running a bit late to class too, huh? Katsuki grimaced but hid it well, or at least he hoped he did. Not Kaken, he noticed. The nickname Deku had used for over a decade to refer to him was nowhere to be found. Honestly, it sounded weird to Katsuki's ears to hear Deku's voice refer to him as anything else. He didn't like it. Yeah. The hag wanted me to spend the weekend before the school year started at home instead of at the dorms. Katsuki said with a practiced level of detachment that he hoped sounded natural. Now I'm gonna be late to the first day back because of her. You shouldn't say stuff like that about your mom. Deku said, turning to continue walking. A single nod of his head was the only indication Katsuki received as an invitation to walk alongside him. She worries about you a lot. At least he's talking, Katsuki thought to himself as the sound of ongoing construction projects filled the air around them as the two hero students walked alongside one another in silence. I noticed you aren't at the dorms either. Katsuki said simply. You get stuck at home too. Nothing like that. The green-haired boy said, his tone of voice lacking the usual manner Katsuki learned to associate him with. It sounded off. I won't be staying at the dorms this year. Katsuki stopped in his tracks, his body numb as the words left Deku's mouth. That couldn't be true. He must have misheard that. Katsuki willed his legs to move again when he noticed that his reaction did not stop Deku's pace. What do you mean you're not staying at the dorms? Akatsuki shouted, some of his normal anger and heat seeping into his words for a moment as he tried to keep pace with the taller boy. My mom wants me to stay at home. Deku said matter-of-factly like he didn't just verbally punch Katsuki in the gut with his admission. She worries about me, is all. The answer didn't sit right with Katsuki, something else was happening, and he knew it. He reached a hand to Izuku's shoulder, stopping him where he stood and forcing the green-haired boy to look at him. What's your problem, Deku? Katsuki said, the usual gruffness seeping into his voice even more. Why are you acting like this? Deku looked down at him, his eyes conveying nothing but confusion before morphing into something that frankly scared Katsuki more than he would like to admit. I don't know what you're talking about, Bakugo. Deku said as he wrapped his bigger hand around Katsuki's own hand, breaking the grip and wrenching it off his shoulder. If you got something to say to me, then say it. We're gonna be late. Katsuki said nothing as he stared into Deku's eyes, finding little of the warmth and emotion he expected to see. This was not the boy he grew up with. This wasn't the boy who reached his hand out to Katsuki to lift him up when he fell. This wasn't the teary-eyed extra who rushed past a police barrier to help save him from a villain. This was not the boy he had fought at Training Ground Gamma with the intent to commit serious harm. Why aren't you calling me Kaken anymore? Katsuki asked briskly, wrenching his hand out of Deku's grip with some effect. So you're all Bakugo this and Bakugo that. What's your problem? You hate that nickname, Deku said, his voice confused as he stared Katsuki down. You always hated that nickname. So why should I keep calling you something you don't want to be called? Because it's okay when you say it. The two stared at each other silently before Deku turned around to continue walking, completely ignoring Katsuki now as they entered the school grounds of UA. This was not how it was supposed to happen. Katsuki and the extras were supposed to be forgiven. Deku said he didn't hate any of them for what they did, so why was he acting like this? Why was he not staying in the dorms? Why wasn't he using that stupid fucking nickname anymore? Hey! Don't ignore me! Katsuki shouted, his voice finally getting the taller boy to stop. I'm talking to you. What? Deku turned to stare at Katsuki, raising his eyebrow, making Katsuki feel much smaller than he did a moment ago. Don't what me? You know what this is about. Katsuki shouted as he took tentative steps towards Deku. He did his best to get in the face of the boy, but the height difference made it difficult. You said you forgave us. You said you didn't hate us for what we did. Was all that bullshit? Deku stood motionless as he stared down at Katsuki. The emotionless look on his face did little to calm the blonde down. If anything, it only made Katsuki even more upset than he was. You think I hate you? Deku said, shock registering in his eyes for a moment before it was covered back up. So is that what this is all about? Katsuki stared hard before he averted his gaze away from the questioning eyes of the taller boy. His hands were shaking, and his knees felt numb, but for the life of him, Katsuki couldn't find it in himself to take a step back. His mind was screaming at him to run, but something kept him in place. I hated you for a while. All of you. Deku said as his vision fell to the floor. Every single one of my friends left me the first chance they got. So why wouldn't I be upset? Why wouldn't I hate you all for what you did? A brief flash of emotion flashed through Deku's eyes, making Katsuki wince at the sight. He had never seen that look cross the boy's face before. Something primal in the back of Katsuki's head lit up like he was staring down an apex predator. But the moment quickly passed after a brief moment, and Deku returned. The first night Eraserhead dropped me off at my mom's apartment, all I did was cry. Deku said, taking a deep breath through his nose as he spoke. I was sad and hurt and angry for a long time after that. I didn't think I would ever stop hurting. I thought about you guys every day. What I must have done wrong. What I could have done to prevent everything from happening. Deku paused as he stared at Katsuki, the same sad smile he wore melting away the shadows of resentment that clouded his voice. Then the next day, I thought about you guys less. Deku continued, not even looking at Katsuki as he took another step away from him and towards the school. Then I thought about you guys less after that. Until one day. Deku stopped and turned to face Katsuki. The sad smile that crossed his features bearing into Katsuki's soul. Then one day, I just stopped thinking about you guys altogether. When that happened, all the anger just sort of slipped away. Katsuki held his breath, like a vain attempt to keep himself hidden despite knowing he was out in the open. This was not how he hoped this would go, but a part of him knew this was the only way it could have. I don't hate you. You know I can't lie to save my life. Deku said, staring down at Katsuki like he was just a stranger on the street. But we're not friends. I don't think we ever were, and I think we should stop pretending we are now. Katsuki felt like he couldn't breathe. Like someone's hand was gripping his throat and squeezing with all their power. He stood frozen for a moment, just watching Izuku walk away from him, like a mirage in the distance he wasn't sure was actually there. You might want to hurry up, Bakugo. Deku said without turning to look at the explosion user. You don't want to be late for our first day of school.